Hi, my name is Carlos Campbell, and today we have a very special guest, Dr. Margaret Mead, one of the leading, if not the leading, anthropologists in the world. This afternoon, and part of today, we spent some time throughout Reston, meeting with people, traveling around, and so we'd like to take this opportunity to give our guest a chance to express herself in terms of some of the things that she's been able to observe here in particular, and certainly with her own concerns for the Newtown movement. I might add that I first had the privilege of meeting Dr. Mead at the 9th Annual Delo Symposium in Athens, Greece, and ever since my own interest in her work as an anthropologist has certainly increased tremendously. And I find that this is a discipline that many of us just are not as familiar with as we need to be, and it's, I think, increasingly becoming more important, particularly as people change their lifestyles, going from rural to urban and then suburban and Newtown, areas. What are your thoughts on what we've been experiencing today?
Well, I've never been to Reston before. I've seen other new towns in other parts of the world, and I'm very much interested in new towns. I think they're very important, if only for the chance to try out new things that then other people in older towns may possibly be able to copy. Not perfectly, but they may learn about them. And the things that interest me most about Reston are the different income levels, the integration, the way in which there are community clusters, where people are close together, and children can walk from one house to another, and then spaces in between that give a sense of rest and the outdoors. The amount of open space there is for all sorts of athletic things. The presence of the senior citizens, so that I understand people have told me there were about 90% of the people who live in Friendship House, is that right?
Fellowship
House, have children or relatives in Reston. And this is one of the things that we're working for hardest, is to have a place where the grandparents and the great-grandparents can live near, but not absolutely with their children. So these are some of the things that have interested me very much, Carlos.
What about the physical form as opposed to the substance? Did you have any initial reactions when you first saw Reston, the way it was designed and laid out, the landscape, the buildings?
It, of course, looks as if it was all made at once. And anything that's brand new looks as if it had all been made at once. I think that's considerably muted by the number of trees. And the large number of trees give one a sense that this isn't an entirely man-made world, and that it's a human world that's related to the natural world.
We have had in the past, I would say, a problem, and I cannot say it's a problem that's been greater in Reston or less in Reston, but a problem that's been highly visible here with teenagers. There's certainly a lack of facilities for teenagers. We don't have a teen center. Columbia, which, as you know, is I guess about 60 miles from here, 35 miles or so north of Washington is another new town. They have 3 teen centers, and I don't mean to imply that we need space, but we certainly have a need for some activities and programs for teenagers. Do you have any thoughts on the importance of establishing programs and possibly facilities along this line?
I think it's very important to have places where young people can go. I'm not absolutely certain that they ever want to go to some place that you set up and tell them to go there. You know, the teen centers have not always been the answer. But you need sort of free space where they can move in, and when they move in, you don't chase them away. These seem to be the important things. Now, those steps out there by the lake, there's a place where they like to sit, you tell me. And if you don't chase them away, that becomes a teen center, you see. Also, I'm not sure that planning teen centers too much by the, senior citizens or middle-aged citizens or parental citizens is always entirely what you need. You need a little more free space. And the trouble with, and they get a storefront in lots of places. And the trouble with a place as new as Reston is there isn't any storefront. I mean, every single place has to be built and used for the purposes it was meant for. Columbia, they've got a bubble, haven't they? They put up a Bucky Fuller bubble. You certainly have room around here for a bubble. I'd like to see in any town that was planned a place where teenagers could go and sleep. Take a sleeping bag and put it down the way they do in lots of places when they travel around the world. So when they're not getting on so well with their family that day, they could go and sleep somewhere else. Or they could sleep there and go to high school and take their laundry home and go home when they were sick. And they wouldn't have to run away in order to get their families off their necks, or their families wouldn't have to drive them away in order to get them out of the house, which is what happens with many runaways. And most of the primitive societies that I've worked in have a place for the teenagers to sleep, sometimes for the girls, but almost always for the boys. They're a nuisance at home. They haven't settled down yet. They're not married. They're rambunctious, and they give them a place where they can make their own racket. Of course, there's also the question of noise, and electrified music today makes quite a lot of noise, and you have to have places for it. But I understand the lake and absorbs quite a little of that, if there is some.
Right, we can accommodate a lot. I think that there's some people that probably move in initially not expecting to have any noise problem, and then of course they find out that that's something they just have to live with, or of course they can also exercise the option and move. I'm not an expert on women. I don't think I'm an expert on anybody, but I have a great concern for the situation that a lot of women are placed in today in Reston and in a lot of suburban jurisdictions. I'm speaking specifically of the housewife who's not working, who is home alone during the day, and does not necessarily find that that is a very comfortable existence, particularly when the kids become somewhat self-sufficient. Do you have any thoughts on this as a problem area?
Well, it's definitely a problem area. Now, from what I've seen, but of course I'm not quite sure, because I've seen the liveliest spots that you thought it was good for me to see, there's certainly been a lot of volunteers everywhere. And Common Ground's run by volunteers, and all the volunteers in the nursery school and volunteers in the daycare center. Adequately organized community that really uses its volunteers meets a lot of the needs of the housebound housewife. Not all of them. You also need chances for them to go out and work or get more education. By the way, one of the things I didn't ask is, where's the nearest higher education around here, community college or anything? How far away is it?
Well, there's several. There's a facility here in Reston that's an extension of the, I believe it's the Virginia Polytechnical Institute, VPI. They have basically some classes, and they have a very small facility here in Reston. Then there's Northern Virginia Community College. I would say driving time, we're talking about 15 minutes. George Mason is probably 20 minutes. They're over in Fairfax. And of course, I think that's about it.
So any woman who wants to go and get more education can get it fairly conveniently.
Yes, but it's not as convenient as in, say, Irvine, California, where they have a major branch of the university. They have the University of California
right
at
there,
Irvine,
I know.
And that's a major activity center within the new town. And they certainly have major activities in terms of universities in Columbia.
Yeah,
I think,
they have Dag Hammarskjöld, and they have Antioch there, don't
Antioch, Dag Hammarskjöld
No.
College. And so they're probably a lot farther along in that respect than we are.
Well, we also, you know, some looking around the world, especially the English have said, if you have a town, a large town without any kind of college in it, some kind of college in it, it's like a town without a soul.
Right. What are your thoughts on what do you feel makes a community as opposed to just being, say, a physical space, a town? What really makes it viable?
Well, I think the primary thing is the concern of the people who live in it for something about it. And sometimes you can have them concerned almost entirely about one thing. They may all get mobilized around the schools or about some other thing they need to work on. But ideally, it also should have at least 3 generations living in, and we're beginning to say 4 now, available. They shouldn't be just families, you know, but older people that are available for younger people. There should be enough for all the 3 generations to do in the community. And it should be a place that you can leave and come back to. And then you can grow up in feeling that you could belong there forever, or you could go away for 40 years and come back. That's the sort of community that we're trying to build today.
I see. Let me ask you this, I guess to maybe change the subject just a little bit, but still stay within the overall Newtown's caveat. Another thing that seems to be visible, and again, I can't pinpoint it, I don't know whether it's peculiar to one's economic category or what, but we seem to have, at least from a visibility standpoint, a high rate of divorce and separation. We seem to have maybe 15 to 20% of the households are headed up by women with children. Do you have any thoughts about this particular lifestyle emerging?
Well, I think there are 2 things. There's one, that people, if their marriage is a bit rocky, tend to think that moving may solve it. Sometimes they think having another child will solve it. Sometimes they think moving. And, you know, something to rattle the cage, and maybe it'll work better. So that undoubtedly in a place that's brand new, you have more people who've moved in the hope of solving things. That's one possibility. Then, as you said, this is a place that if you do get a divorce, women can live. They can rent a house, and their credit is all right. The bank doesn't object to letting them have a bank account, I suppose, and letting them have credit. And in many places in this country, a woman just can't do any of these things. So it might be that because this is a safer place, see, suppose you had 3 children in a very rockety marriage, and you had a choice of moving to 3 or 4 places. You'd pick a place where women were treated well, rather than a place where they knew they'd have to move, couldn't possibly keep the kids in school in case the marriage broke up.
I'm very fascinated by the different lifestyles that are seemingly accommodated here in Reston. When I say lifestyles, I'm talking about people living together, not being married, people that have been married, remaining here, and things like that. It seems as though Reston may be, and the New Town movement may be, a little ahead of the rest of the nation in trying to experience new forms of freedom. I'm also concerned with your thoughts on this whole issue of loneliness. We've recently had some discussions here about the whole business of just being lonely, being cooped up, even though we're on television, people being overly involved with just looking at television and not really being out and interacting. Do you have any thoughts on the loneliness issue?
Well, I think the suburb, the typical suburb, is the most lonely thing in the world, you know. And we even have studies that show what happens to young mothers in a suburb, where not a single female relative or friend is within a long distance. And then you have a great deal of postpartum breakdown when the first baby's born. It looks to me as if Reston wouldn't be as lonely. You know, that these clusters of houses that are closer than the space suburb. There isn't as much anonymity. People can go downtown. I suppose downtown is by the lake, or where common ground is. What do you call that?
That's the Lake End Village Center.
Center. But when they go there, where do they say they're going?
To the center.
To the center. So they can go down to the center and meet people and find people that they know and find somebody to talk to. And one of the most important things in the world today, I think, is when people come home at night to find somebody to talk to, especially the ones that are living alone, single people or heads of household, or with the fathers traveling and all of those things. Find somebody to talk to. Now, I don't know that you have a daycare center there in the center. Do you have any place where people can leave their kids, little kids, for an hour or so?
Not to my knowledge. I think the daycare center is something, you know, more formal.
Formal. But that's one of the
much
things
more
you
structured.
need.
I think when people get into a situation where they just need child care for an hour, they probably call a babysitter or leave the child at a friend's house or something like that.
Because you do have a babysitter service that involves the older people.
Yes,
And
the
I
older
think
ones.
that's excellent.
Yes.
I should think one would be less lonely here. Not than they would be in the town they grew up in. They'd grown up in a real town and not a suburb. But much lonelier than if they lived in an ordinary suburb or went as a stranger to a new place.
Right. One of the things that's fascinated me about the Newtown experience has been the extent to which we've been able to affect racial integration. Now, on the surface, it appears, you know, we have the appearance of integration. And I guess you'd have to talk to everybody individually to define that substantively to see the extent to which people are involved. But we haven't had major conflicts. We have problems in schools with reading materials, things like this, and small problems, you know, problems with a small p. We haven't had the major conflicts and confrontations that have taken place in a lot of suburban jurisdictions. Do you have any thoughts, or are you optimistic or pessimistic on this whole issue of racial integration and the ability of large groups of people to actually assimilate and live together
Well,
happily?
I think that one of the important things here, you know, I saw the slideshow, which is a very formal sort of presentation for people who might be thinking of locating here, I suppose, or industry or something. But over and over again in that slideshow, you saw black and white children, or black and white people. Now, in other words, anybody who moves here knowing this is an integrated community. And so half the argument is over. And most of the trouble in this country comes from people who get frightened about a possibility that hasn't occurred yet. You know, we found this over and over again. And you find it not only with black and white, you find it with letting women do anything new. You tell a town you're going to have women taxi cab drivers. And then wait a year before by that time everybody has gotten into an uproar about the women taxi cab drivers. So that the more places we have, more communities, more schools, more activities that are explicitly integrated, there they are, and everybody can see it. You know, and that's one of the nice things about black-white integration. You can just take a picture of it and everybody knows it. The less trouble you have. And it's little tight towns that have grown up and gotten awfully used to the way they're living, that are afraid of everything. You know, any new people move in, they're afraid, you know, there are communities around New York that are afraid of United Nations diplomats moving in. Just anything new frightens them. And a new town, it's new altogether. And so you can accept a great many things easily that people have much more trouble accepting in old situations.
In England, in Sweden, and I expect in Australia, the national government takes a much more involved and substantive interest in the development of new towns. In this country, we have one tool legislatively, Title VII, which was passed in 1970. I think so far 17 new towns have been guaranteed by the federal government. Do you have any thoughts as to what an appropriate role is, or how the lack of involvement of the federal government may adversely affect the new town movement?
Well, the federal government would do it, but as I understand, there was a 10-month pause, wasn't there, in doing anything. It's one thing to say we have 17 towns, but we had 15 of them started over a year ago, didn't we, and only
That's right.
2 since. And it was a good start. I'm not at all sure that the guaranteeing by the federal government and then leaving a great deal more to other enterprise may not be a good thing if it gets enough impetus. But if you leave too much to your private developers and then they get stuck, they can't quite afford it. One of the better things about the involvement of the federal government, as I understand it, is it gives a longer time span before the thing has to work, doesn't it?
Patient money essentially is made available because you can get a loan guarantee to cover a period between 20 and 30 years.
Yes.
And normally it may take anywhere between 6 and 10 years before you can affect a positive cash flow. And the front-end costs are almost prohibitive, so it discourages a lot of large institutions from becoming involved in the new town development without the endorsement or the involvement of the federal government. Do you have any thoughts in terms of, do you have any criticisms of new towns?
Well, I think that if we got to think that the only way we could get a decent way of life was in a new town, it would be a mistake, you see. And sometimes you hear people speak that way. Well, it's just hopeless to do anything with a ghetto, or down inner city anywhere. It's hopeless to do anything with a suburb. You're stuck with a suburb. There are no sidewalks, and houses are all the same size and shape, and you can't do anything about it. So I like the general picture of new town and new towns in town, so that you reconvert an old, broken-down community again into a new community. That is, to have different degrees of newness. And you can even take a most disastrously planned suburb and turn it into a town, and take everything we know that we try to put into a new town and put quite a lot of it into an old town,
right,
if we work at it.
I don't know if you recall at Delos, Eric Erickson and Jonas Salk, remember that evening they gave a lecture, yes. Each of them gave a lecture, and I had asked them about this business about over-design and the whole purpose of man and man's challenge and the environment, man generically. I understood Dr. Salk to say, first of all, that if we planned too much and made things too convenient, that man would regress. And I recall Dr. Erickson saying that no one's really ever studied and got involved with the problems of over-design and over-development and getting above the so-called optimum level. Have you given any thoughts to issues in this area?
I don't think there's any doubt that an over-planned place discourages people. And I think they cited the University of Santa Cruz in California as one of the places that they'd planned everything, you know, where every walk was going to go before the students came in. It would have been much better to have left it sort of half done, build the basic things that had to be done in advance, and then let the students work it out. You know, let them decide where they wanted to walk and then lay the pavement down. You have to have a pavement finally, or it's too muddy. And it's certainly much better for people to be able to do things with their environment. And if things are too neat and too nice, and you can't put any nails in the wall, and this is the thing I think turns kids off in college dormitories. Everybody's concerned with what you can't do there in order to preserve it, instead of what you can do there. I don't see any reason why something the size of Reston shouldn't have a lot of free space that people could experiment with, put up Bucky Fuller domes in, move them around, and do quite a lot of things. But I do think it's important.
One final question. I remember Doc Ziadas confessing his architectural crimes. Remember he went through his thing on the high-rises. Today we went up in Fellowship House, and I must confess I had never been up in Fellowship House before, and I was surprised to find the laundry facilities on the, it was either the 8th or the 9th floor. The 9th floor, and the craft rooms. And when I was talking with Gloria Siegel in Cedar Riverside about the high-rises out there, I was suggesting something along this line, because people seem to get so isolated in these tall buildings. Have you given any thought to this high-rise business?
I've given quite a little thought to it, because in Australia it's a great, and I've just been out there, and they've been claiming that high-rises made people commit suicide. But if you examine carefully, the people who dislike high-rises are, on the whole, poor people. And if they're rich, they pay anything to get on top of a building. Now, I don't believe the nervous system of rich and poor people are quite that different. That the real truth is that people who are isolated anyway, who don't know anybody, they probably have a better chance of getting to know somebody if they live right next door on the level than if they're on the 6th floor, and they have a lot of trouble taking care of their children. It's not a good place for people with little children. But there's no reason why people can't enjoy being in a high-rise. And the old lady who took us into our room today, her room to show us.
Right, Mrs. Lind, I believe.
Yes, she said, look out the window. And then she told that story that when she was a child, mother never let them put down the curtains till the sun went down.
Right.
And that you get in a high-rise and get a sense of looking over the whole place. I think it's better for old people and young people without children. And not a very good place for children because getting up and down the elevators and stairs is too difficult.
You have written 18 books?
Something like that.
18? Can you give me some advice so I can finish the one I'm doing now?
Well, realize it's the first book,
Right.
and it'll never be as hard again.
Okay. I certainly want to thank you, and I'm sure, I know the entire community wants to thank you for being so generous with your time, and I'm going to exercise what is probably not a real prerogative, but I'm going to thank you on behalf of everybody in Reston for being kind enough to share your time and your thoughts with us. And we hope you'll have an opportunity to come back sometime.
Thank you.
Thank you.